Okay, I think it's time to start. Welcome to our Visiting Fellows seminar, and I have a pleasure to introduce you our speaker, Libora Oates-Indruchová, obtained her PhD from the University of Lancaster and habilitation from the University of Szeged in Hungary. She's a professor of sociology of gender in the Department of Sociology at the University of Graz, Austria. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So, first of all, I'm so happy to be here, and thank you to the Aleksanteri Institute for having me. It is an escape from a place which is actually not so bad, really. It's too many obligations, and so to be here is really a great privilege. And it's not my first time at Aleksanteri. I've been here attending the Aleksanteri conferences over the last decade several times and in other capacities, but first time as a visiting fellow. And what I'm going to do today is to present what I would call an executive summary of a book manuscript that I just sort of completed like 2 days before I came here. It's a project on which I've been working for ages and ages, and not that I'm such a slow writer, although I am a slow professor. I'm not a very fast writer, but rather I had to take time off, 2 years here, 3 years there, and so the book took such a long time. I usually hate reading my talk, so I usually just speak with the slides, but since we have the video here today, it made me actually mighty nervous. So half of the talk is without reading, and half the talk will be actually, I do have text written here. So without further ado, here we go. This is what I'm going to be talking about. Today, I will introduce the project and the questions, and then you may notice these sort of funny headings that I have as on the points. And they are there because the project has this sort of methodological part, the sort of visual methodological part. And there will be the photographs you will see a part of the project. And actually, there are more photographs, but there are 4 pairs with these titles: the prologue, the action, the inspiration, and anticipation, anticlimax. And they sort of correspond to sort of parts of the research process, but also chapters of the book. I will not talk about them. It's just that, this is what it means. Why, these funny headings. And this, so the project on censorship that I worked on, I started working on it a long time ago, and I was interested in scholarly publishing in general under political repression. And my case studies where I started actually just with Czechoslovakia, with the Czech part of Czechoslovakia, but then for methodological reasons it was necessary to do some additional study on Hungary. Today I will sort of restrict myself largely to the Czech side. I researched the last 2 decades of state socialism, and I will tell you why. And generally the topic was the issues of reader-author communication under these sort of politically repressive conditions. As methods, I used largely semi-structured interviews. In the Czech Republic, this is really an sort of ancient research by now. I started in 2002 doing the interviews. I don't think if I try to do this project today, I don't think it will be possible. It was already complicated enough then, and today that would be basically impossible. And then in Hungary, somewhat later. And I also used, as an additional 2 sources, document sources. One source would be science policies of the time in both countries, and the other was the archives of the editorial board of the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. As to who I interviewed, I think the academics could be generally sort of described in the sort of wider possible sense as the gray zone academics. So people who wouldn't be the apparatchiks, but they also wouldn't be self-declared dissidents, at least not for most of the period, although some of my interviewees sort of later, during the perestroika years, did move more toward dissent, and some is not publishing. But let's say there would be academics whose loyalty we could describe as their primary loyalty was to their profession and to their discipline rather than to the ideology of the party at that time. And the how I chose them, it was sort of more or less a snowball sample, but the criterion was that they were recommended by their peers at the time of the interviews as people who were respected in their fields for the work that they already did during state socialism. So these weren't people who just suddenly appeared, but who were respected already during state socialism as good academics. And at the time when I interviewed them, they mostly were heads of departments or research institutes, or at least senior academics at the position of professor or docent. I then analyzed my data through using elements of constructivist grounded theory, working mostly with the American grounded theorist Kathy Charmas's work. And also what I actually found really sort of inspiring was work by your Finnish colleague from Tampere, I believe, Pertti Alasutari. Apologies for the pronunciation, which I probably didn't get right. And I started working with his methodology way before I ever heard of Aleksanteri Institute. So this is really sort of coincidence. Maybe I was always meant to be drawn in this direction here. Since we are, this didn't quite transfer as it should have from my Mac to the PC. So apologies for the mess on the slide. Since we are here from working on various countries and in various disciplines, I will just sort of briefly introduce some historical context of the period that I was researching. You probably all know 1968 Prague Spring, followed by the Soviet-led invasion, and then what followed where there was this vetting first of all party members and also of non-party members, and with various repressions which in academia, and other researchers show this, were actually more severe than in other areas of life. Then already from the 1970s, when the so-called normalization begins, so normalization when the party tries to consolidate its power to regain its leading role in society, in academia, new science policies and pieces of legislation are put in place to allow more ideological control. And then there is a further sort of tightening from the ideological perspective in the aftermath of Charter 77. And then in the late 1980s, there is a relative relaxation from the political point of view, but as my interviews showed, only for some, and I will be talking about it a bit later. But generally the perception was that 1968, at least in scholarly life, had effects all the way through until the end of state socialism. Now I presented first results of this project at Aleksanteri before, in November 2007. I was then working mostly on the science policies, and from the science policies, what the metaphor that came to mind was not the big brother, the usual metaphor, but the metaphor, the Eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. Why the Eye of Sauron? And I picked specifically this image I stole. I have no copyrights for this, okay? So careful what you show, what you do in the video streaming. The point of the Eye of Sauron is that where its gaze falls, that part of the Middle Earth falls under shadow, and it goes ever further and further and further. And I thought this was really the fitting metaphor for normalization academia in Czechoslovakia. And definitely that was the sort of the discourse of the dominant discourse. I mean, that's what I got from the archives, from the policy documents, where the party takes more and more and tighter control of academic life, just like the Eye of Sauron. But I already then, I think, ended with saying, well, it seems that the interviews are showing something else, that they show that there is some sort of resistance brewing in various parts, and I called it sort of with tongue-in-cheek or question mark, is it the enemy within? So that's what I presented 10 years ago. In this whole project, I was asking 4 questions, and then a 5th one came along as I did my data analysis. And the questions concerned both of the institutions and the people within those institutions. So what was the institutional context and how did people handle that context? then I was, of course, interested in, so what happens to an idea from its inception in the head of an academic through all the parts of the publication process all the way to post-publication reception? Who is the author, really, in these conditions, and how do authors think with this hindsight, about their work? What is their relationship to their texts? And then, obviously, we are talking about texts. So, what was the language of these used for writing academic texts in this period? And was there perhaps something like a code of communication between the author and the reader? How they decoded, let's say, some subversive meanings in the text or not? And then finally, the fifth question, which sort of came along, which I didn't expect to be there, but it emerged basically at the sort of halfway through the project and became the central theoretical question of the project, is so what really was the effect of censorship, the end effect of censorship on intellectual thought? Because you may know that there are two schools in this regard in theories of censorship. One school that dates back to the 1950s and to Leo Strauss says, well, actually censorship is really good for creative and critical thought because it forces the authors to be always, one step ahead before the censor, so it creates all these new meanings and creative ways of handling language. The other school, as you can imagine, says the exact opposite, that the end effect of censorship is that it's detrimental to creativity and critical thought. Why? Because as the authors always have to sort of look over the shoulder at what the censor might be thinking and might be objecting to, they basically constantly have to put themselves into the mind of the censor. And so in the end, there is nothing like writing between the lines, because what's between the lines is always already part of the dominant discourse. And one of the main proponents of this school would be Miklós Haraszti, a Hungarian author, but many others say a similar thing. From Kodzia, the South African writer, to some current writers in Muslim countries which are subject to censorship. And what was puzzling in this particular project was that both of these views appeared with about the same frequency in the interviews. And one wouldn't really expect that, because it's a relatively homogeneous group. We are talking about a fairly brief period of time, 20 years. So why would these both opinions be sort of expressed with the same frequency, both of them? And so that the riddle as to why do these appear became the theoretical question of the project. Just briefly about censorship in the Eastern Bloc, and what your familiarity is with this whole sort of area of inquiry. The point being that it's not homogeneous across the whole time in all the countries. There were countries which had a formal censoring institution, others didn't. Others had it only for some part of the state socialist period. Some had it, in some it concerned only some areas, in others some areas were exempt. And these, if there is no censoring institution, then that doesn't mean that there is no censorship, obviously. And the sort of useful concept here is the one by Richard Burt, who says, well, if any restrictions on scholarly creation in the countries without formalized censorship had to be either sort of dispersed through the various elements of the publishing process and then displaced away from the overseeing center. Now, most of the works on state socialist censorship focused so far on the repressive actions of institutions against the creative spirit and try to build a taxonomy of state socialist censorship. And these taxonomies describe largely how the state and its agencies acted on the writer and worked together as a system. In recent years, there have been some scholars looked into what's called a new censorship, a new school of how to look at censorship. and have a less totalizing view, and they emphasize complicity, resistance, and negotiation. Now, I was looking at all stages of the writing process in my project, and I was mainly interested in looking at the self-perceptions of the creative actors in of publishing and censorship. So my focus then was rather than on this institutional pressure on the instrumentalization of the creative elements, rather on agency and negotiation. And I was sort of asking, so okay, there we have, of course, substantial work on Russian or Soviet censorship and elsewhere on Aesopian strategies in language. And what are these strategies and what do they actually do? And my thesis was that, well, Aesopian strategies in literature or arts, when we are looking at multiplicity of meanings, definitely, or we can say, well, this is definitely something creative, when we have a plurality of meaning, that we can say, well, it enriches our understanding of literary text. However, if we are talking about scholarship, so social sciences and humanities, there the point is sort of rather different. We are aiming not at multiplicity of meanings, we are aiming at precision. And so if we are talking about Aesopian language in scholarship, what does it actually do? How effective are these Aesopian strategies to communicate scientific ideas? And I use a model in my work which is not only dispersed and multi-staged, but also hierarchical, because not all the actors who have a sensoric capacity have somehow the same power or have to be sort of fought in the same way. And both countries, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, were countries which didn't have a censoric institution. Czechoslovakia did until 1968. Then there was a general abolition of censorship in June 1968 and reinstitution in September. However, this law, which is briefly referred to as the press law, specifically exempts all scholarship from censorship. But obviously we know that wasn't the end of censorship. And so that's why I treat this environment as a place without a censoring institution. Now you can see that I changed my metaphor. I no longer speak about the Eye of Sauron, but talk about snakes and ladders, which is a board game. If you know, are you familiar with the board game? Not everybody. The point of the game is to get from point A to point B, as in all board games, or most of them, and you roll your die, and either you sort of land on just a normal square, or a square which has a ladder or a snake on it. If you land on a ladder, you skip several stages and you progress, you jump ahead. So you get to the point B, to the goal faster. If you land on a snake, you slither down several layers, and you have to start over, or you have to go back. And so when I've done all my data analysis, this metaphor seemed to be capturing much better than whether Big Brother or Eye of Sauron, the situation in at least normalization Czechoslovakia. Although the story of power of the science policies and even of the to an extent the archives of the Academy of the editorial board of the Academy of Sciences gave this sort of very linear story of ever continuing, ever harsher ideological tightening, which sort of unrelentless. The story of the subjects of power, so to speak, was much more complex, and so it rather reminded me of this game of snakes and ladders, like when do they sort of land on a square which helps them and which sort of brings them down. Obviously it's a bit tongue-in-cheek because we would assume that a creative person has more agency than whether they land on a ladder or on a snake. Now, why do we get these two narratives? The Eye of Sauron, and then the linear, there is ever more control, and then the other one, which is basically not so clear. First thing is that when we look even into the policy documents, we find that there is a change of emphasis in the way that they are phrased from focus on the actual, like on actual content of what, I don't know, the subject matter. Are we talking about phenomenology, or how is, who is a citizen? What is the role of individual in history? Any sort of like a real scientific question, to just form how is something spoken about, and that starts sort of by late 1970s. Sort of any sort of issues of content disappear from the policy documents, and there is far more emphasis than it also then comes in the interviews. The same thing, that there is no longer any emphasis on any real convictions, but rather on sort of appearance of ideological loyalty. So no longer any sort of creative approach, let's say, to the theory of Marxism-Leninism is required. It's just, let's all agree that we are going to be talking about things in this way and no other ways. And I will refer you to quote number 1 on your handout for an illustration of this issue. Now, this Sauronic approach. Yeah, I had the handouts, like 15 of them. You don't have some left over. Oh, that's just your only copy. Sorry, I'm flattered that so many people of you came. Thank you. I use János Kornai's expression, over-centralization. Basically, this idea, this intention to capture, to rule over the entire academia from the top to the rank and file, and have everything under control from the center, was essentially, just like in economy, just too cumbersome. And the center also required feedback from the rank and file. So by the time some idea or directive traveled all the way down and back, there was lots of entropy happened along the way, and also a lot of let's say, resistant strategies were developed by the various actors involved in the process. So I think that's partially why the story of power tells one story, but the story of practice, or of the actual actors involved, tells another story. And as I know, the documents really don't have any relief. Even during perestroika, there is only ever increasing ideological tightening from 69 to 89. But then if we confront the documents and the stories of the participants of academic life between 69 and 89, we find that there was not only the Cold War divide, which one would expect in language and in treating scholarly matters, but also a Prague Spring political divide. So there was very clearly the us and them, not us and them east-west, but us and them as the sides where stood in the reform process of the Prague, leading to the Prague Spring. And I refer you to quote number 2 for an illustration. However, there is also a generational change that happens during those 20 years of normalization. Obviously, things are not the same. The generation that comes to academia, that is in academia in 68, very clearly distinguishes between the us and them. It's clear who is who, and they perceive the changes that happen in academia as being normalized. However, the younger scholars who then come after 68, for them that situation is no longer normalized, it's just normal. And that has implications to how they look at the subjects which are being researched, to how the institutional structures work, and also to how they use language in their academic work. And there's an example, is quote number 3 on your handout. So now to the first question, people in institutions. When we look at the institutions, what sometimes is not acknowledged in this general narrative of repression is that actually in 68, the so-called normalizers were actually in a minority. So it took a year to consolidate before the so-called normalization begins and actually the repressions begin. And that year arguably gave time to those involved to close ranks and come up with strategies and solidarity and some defense. The normalizers intended to take over the minds and also of the hearts. So they really, it's clear from the documents that they really wanted people to believe in the new order. But that rather failed. They applied a very strict top-down approach, so they first sort of grabbed, so directives are always from the center, then any initiative from the middle, not welcome, not possible. So everything came from the center, and also in getting the normalization in its stride, they first grabbed the very top layers of the academy. So let's say the heads or directors of research institutes, department heads, and editors-in-chiefs of journals, disbanded academic boards, editorial boards, sorry. And then they went deeper and deeper, sort of with every year of normalization to have really sort of to capture everybody. And how did people respond to this institutional environment? Well, first of all, they learned to translate and adapt the language of propaganda to suit, to still allow them to continue their work up to a point, or at least to find a niche for themselves. Same things with the official research topics. There was always the 5-year plan of state plan of research, with topics which were supposed to be research in every discipline. And so they managed to tweak those in such a way that it suited their research interests. And I put an example in quote number 4 on the handout. And also with progressing years, the people became, of course, more and more skillful in handling the institutional environment, and they developed alternative spaces for academic discussions, such as various seminars and professional societies, which were entirely working within the system, but they attracted a certain circle of people. Also, those organizers made sure that only certain people were invited. So these were sort of more or less closed circles, which, however, allowed sort of freer academic discussion. What we also experience here is a discursive shift when, in post-1969 time, there were clearly institutional leaderships is in the hands of people that had some personal relationship to the divisions of the Prague Spring. And we have an illustration in quote number 5. But in later years, these were gradually replaced by people without any personal history with 68. And that affected their relationship to the authoritative discourse. It was very clear for the group A, for the generation A, and much less clear for the generation B. And that has to do with this sort of emptying of the content of meaning and moving on to form, but also, let's say, to the possibilities that open up for some academics, what they could do. Now, early normalization targeted people and institutions rather than a specific content of scholarly texts. Those who expected persecution for the part they played during the Prague Spring, or because of their research orientation, took often active steps toward their own professional survival, rather than waited for an institutional decision on their fate. They strategized either to keep any form of professional existence, to continue in their area of research, or later, when the worst years were over, they aimed at professional development. And this latter marks a generational shift, as it appears only in the narratives of scholars who had a personal history connected to 68. So only this older generation speaks at all about that there is some sort of a loosening, let's say in the 1980s. The younger generation doesn't mention any loosening at all. Generally, when it comes to the sort of the trajectory of manuscripts through the publication process, what comes out clearly from the interviews is the lack of clarity of any written rules. It was all sort of a guessing game, and so in this situation, obviously, every publication was a risk. So to publish basically was not really what a lot of people wanted to do, because that meant potentially getting into trouble. So it wasn't publish or perish as we now all experience. It was publish and perish was rather the order of the day. And I put a quote number 7 to illustrate this part of the argument. Inevitably, personal relationships took precedence over the professional standards for example, in the review process. The need brought together groups of trusted friends and acquaintances that formed what I call gated communities, publishing spaces designed to keep out outsiders because they could infiltrate and cause trouble. A shortage of resources further exacerbated the importance of personal alliances. In short, written and unwritten rules, modified by exemptions and complications, regulated every step of a manuscript toward publication. Who and under what conditions could write and publish, where and how often, who supervised the process, to whom and under what circumstances the regulations did not apply, and what were the sanctions for transgressions. And again, there is a quote to illustrate. The next step, the author, and this is where we really sort of come to the sort of gist of experience with censorship. So all of these sort of perceived or real rules kept changing over the period. Spells of relative ideological relaxation alternated with ideological turns of the screw in response to the overall political situation, such as perestroika or activism around Charter 77. The scholars differed in the amount of personal experience with censorship. Most frequently, they listed examples of various forms of preventive censorship and self-censorship, less frequently post-publication censorship, and some even insisted that they had never been subject to any act of censorship whatsoever. And you have a quotation number 9 that relates to this area of issues. There are reports of actual textual censorship, that is, that they would be told to remove this or that part of a text they authored, were relatively rare. If they did occur, then usually as accounts of friendly censorship, a form of censorship halfway between preventive censorship and self-censorship. A colleague or the publisher's editor would verbally advise them to change wording of some parts of the document. But even then, the advice included additions rather than omissions to make the text politically palatable, and you have an example in your quote number 10. Authors were, however, not entirely at the mercy of the system in resisting censorship. The lack of clear boundaries allowed for negotiation and varying interpretations. Authors, line managers, and editors couldn't exercise agency as individuals, even if that agency took the form of self-censorship. The general awareness that constraints did exist made self-censorship pervasive, but also elusive, because it did not necessarily have to be conscious, but passed into the bloodstream, so to speak. And you have an example of that in quote number 11. Peer communities provided a further support to researchers in the plight with censorship. Some of these communities created the alternative spaces within the system, for example, annual seminars by invitation only, which provided a forum for freer discussion. The Czech scholars reported much less frequent and less dramatic personal or second-hand experience with post-publication censorship than the Hungarian narrators. Yet some of their accounts were saturated with memories of fear, like almost like obsessive, stifling fear, while the Hungarians often spoke of enjoying a considerable degree of academic freedom, despite having colleagues and friends who lost their jobs in retaliation for something they wrote, or in extreme cases went to prison. The crux of this difference seems to lie in the far less systematic preventive censorship in Hungary than in the Czech academia, where the foggy rules further exacerbated the anxiety. They kept everybody at all levels alert, even oversensitized to textual minutiae before a text was printed, so that post-publication censorship became almost superfluous. The proactive censorship resulting from the guessing game of the hypothetical objections the reader at the next level might raise made everybody at different stages of the publishing process both a censor and censored, and consequently inclined to censoring perhaps more than was even necessary. The side effect of this dynamic between mechanisms of surveillance and resistance was a destabilization of the very category of authorship. The author's control over their text diminished, and they themselves then undermined the concept of the author by resorting to publishing under the pseudonyms or the anonymous et al. Or alonyms. I call it ghost authoring, that the person who was printed as the author wasn't actually the author. Yeah? Politicization did not plague only people and their line of argumentation, but also research subjects and certain words or concepts. The subjects of research range from desirable, acceptable to sensitive or deemed downright unacceptable for socialist reality. You have a quote, number 12, to illustrate. This categorization went hand in hand with the use of language that reflected the Cold War division of the world into good and bad, each side being often associated with particular school of thought or research topics. A second binary, one that resulted from the political positioning in relation to the Prague Spring, as I said, developed in the Czech environment. The authors either felt compelled to write on any research subject with regard to these binaries and only in binaries, or they tried to transform the research areas they found themselves on the bad side of the political divide in such a way that they became presentable on the good side. Research on lifestyle is an example. After '68, there was no more research on lifestyle, but what appears suddenly is a research on a socialist way of life. Totally different, as you can see. One researcher calls this a language of attributive phrases. And that emerged by this process and could lead either to increased sensitivity to language or the exact opposite, actually, to a loss of attention to language. Yeah? The linguistic sensitivities differed according to the audience of the given text. The smaller and more specialized the audience, the greater the liberty of word choice. There seem to be, in fact, two parallel academic worlds. Scholars at the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences and at universities had to exercise more caution than researchers in applied research institutes. While in Hungary, the dividing line ran between the Academy of Sciences on the one hand and universities on the other. Yeah? Now I'm coming to the end. The need to write only on some subjects and in a particular way, by definition, produce a debate in the interviews around the possible existence of a certain code of communication between the author and the reader, or Aesopian language. The implication is that coding honed critical reading and creativity. If the authors at all acknowledged that such a practice existed, they tended to see its importance in imaginative literature and in poetry, but much less in scholarly writing. There, they conceded that perhaps it rested in layering the text or in stylistics. The former, so the layering of text, involved a complex textual strategy, creating sort of a Bakhtinian dialogic text rich in intertextual references, which required that the reader were in and on the same wavelength. You have a quote, number 14, where a researcher describes this. The latter, the stylistics, required that the reader was knowledgeable of a certain and arguably limited vocabulary. She or he needed not need to decode, but merely to translate. And we can say that's a fairly mechanical skill if it's a limited vocabulary. The translating would have more likely led to decreased attention to the precise meaning of words rather than to critical and creative thinking. This brings us to the answer to the question of why the two contrary views on the effect of censorship appeared in this small and relatively homogeneous sample. It was a matter of erroneous interpretation of textual practices. Layering was not an effective communication strategy, while the narrators defending the stylistic strategies as a form of coding mistook translation for coding. Consequently, the situation in which the communication between the author and the reader fails, and the failure is not compensated by another gain, such as cultivating critical reading and formulation skills, that indicates that the effect of censorship is unequivocally detrimental. which begs the question of the legacy the state socialist practices in scholarly publishing left behind. And my very conclusions: ideologically based dualistic approach, whether to research problems or to the interpretation of history, has been a heavy burden of post-socialist scholarly and public discussions. One of the informants went so far as to say that all that happened after the fall of the regime was a reversal of whose voice was now legitimate and whose not, but that the practices remained the same. If true, it could be at least partially explained by the post-socialist strengths of the symbolism of oppression and resistance that left little space for the development of a greater variety of discourses. Another and logical part of the problem, however, lies in the defense mechanisms originally devised by the various actors to counter the political power. The importance of personal relationships, reluctance to describe processes of consequence in writing, smokescreen strategies, sliding over the precise meaning of words. In post-socialism, these may have become defense mechanisms of old actors in new positions of power against newcomers from the ranks of people, subjects, schools of thought, methodologies, or emergent publishing communities. Add to that a culture of insecurity and lack of clear rules as the operating environment, and it will become apparent what obstacles may have stood in the way of a change toward a more open and merit-based system of scholarly research and publishing. A system that will benefit the production of knowledge, first of all, rather than require that new authors continue to learn and play the game of snakes and ladders. Thank you very much.